All right, well, we're going to continue talking about peace. And one of the things we recognize as we look at the ways in which the story of Jesus in particular, right, seeks to move us toward peace, is that peace relates to multiple dimensions of our lives. And these are kind of relational dimensions, right? There's this internal sense of self that we have to wrestle with, and that sense of peace that we desire and that we seek, I think, a lot of the time for our own kind of internal well-being, right? But that is not in isolation. We also have notions of how we think about a relationship to God or to the divine, and that's connected to the sense of self. They impact and relate to one another, as does our relationships to others and those who are around us. These all intersect and overlap and shape one another, as does our relationship to the wider kind of communities that we build into the world that we live in, and the kind of a relationship even to the natural world as well, right? Peace is what sort of we seek and we desire, but at the intersection of all of those different related domains of our lives. And if we just kind of try and treat them in isolation from one another, I think this is where a part of our big struggle is. And of course this means that peace is not easy and straightforward, but a part of what this kind of vision of the life that Jesus seems to call people toward is about how we cultivate and move toward peace in those domains of our lives. Peace with God, or peace with the divine, is in particular what I want to reflect on just for a moment. And, it's a big theme within the Christian tradition. And I've argued, and I do argue at times, that we have boiled Christianity down to only thinking about this kind of vertical peace, being put right with God. And yet I think there's more going on in the story than that. And in fact, even the way we talk about peace with God, I think, has been shaped by some ways of understanding the Jesus story that I want to reflect on and ask some questions of and interrogate a little bit and see if there's some other ways we might think about this too. Because, peace with God or with the gods, right, is one of the human questions. It certainly has been for a lot of human community. In many respects, though, we have this quite different view of the world, of God or of the gods, and of what's going on here than a lot of ancient people did, a very long time ago. It was really common in ancient cultures to believe that there was conflict between us and God. And in fact, in many cultures and stories and so on, there is also conflict between the gods themselves. Conflict is understood often to be at the heart of things. And as I think I said in the first reflection in the series, that kind of makes sense from a certain point of view, because that's a lot of what we see in the world. But what this kind of cultivated amongst a lot of ancient folk is this common sense of kind of anxiety and uncertainty about our relationship with the divine. Are we okay with God? And is God okay with us? And I wonder if in many respects what we were doing as ancient people, and I think what we still do, right, is to project onto God an anxiety we had about ourselves and about our place in the world. Am I okay? Are we okay? Or what about the violence we just participated in? And what does that mean for us? Or what about the fact that it isn't raining and our crops are dying? Does that mean God is unhappy with us? Or maybe our more modern questions are like, what about the fact that this thing didn't turn out the way that I hoped, or that change that I was looking for didn't come? The prayer that wasn't answered, the sickness of my father or of my partner, does that mean I'm not a good person, or that there's somehow distance between me and God, or that God is disappointed or even angry with me, right? These are understandable questions. And these are the kinds of questions and conclusions and ponderings that the ancient scriptures are filled with also. In the book of Deuteronomy, which is one of the books in the early part of the Old Testament, there's this quite clear idea, and it's one of the traditions within the Old Testament accounts. It's one of the traditions within the story that has this very clear kind of sense that if you follow God's rules, God will bless you, and if you don't, God will curse you. And so if things are going badly for you, well, that tells you God is unhappy with you, right? That's one of the threads within the tradition. In Leviticus, a different book, there's all of these instructions about how to sacrifice animals and crops and so on, so that you'll find peace with God and in your own heart and family. Or in the book of Proverbs, you'll find loads of wisdom sayings that suggest, if you do this, then God will be pleased with you and life will go well for you and so on. So there are these kinds of threads within the tradition that say, yes, you have to do this in order to be right with God, and if you don't, then things won't go well for you. And that's how you'll know that you and God are not okay. And it's a way of kind of making sense of the world, right? There is also, though, it's not as straightforward as this in the biblical narrative. And so Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, for example, he talks about the fact that the story is filled with both testimony and what he calls counter-testimony, right? So there are all these parts of the story that say, do this, and this is how, God will be pleased with you, and then this will happen, and you'll be right with God. And that will play out for prosperity and blessing and answers to your prayers and deliverance and so on. But then there are also all these parts of the stories where things go badly for people who do all the right things. And that perspective is also preserved within the tradition. It's in the Psalms. It's in the story of someone like a Job. There are a number of places in which this is then like the counter-testimony. What happens? How do we talk about what happens when we've done all the things right? We apparently are right with God, and yet life is not going well. And so, some of the prophets even pose, hey, maybe God doesn't need your sacrifices in order to make things right. Maybe that's not the way to think about God. And maybe things aren't going well, and it's got nothing to do with whether you've disappointed God or made God angry. As one of the wisdom writers says, the rain falls on the just and the unjust, Now, in many respects, I think the story of Jesus, right, continues the sacred tradition of wrestling with this question. And I don't think at times often what the Bible is trying to do is say, and this is the one sentence answer to that question. Are we at peace with God or not? But I think the story of Jesus continues that conversation and poses a way of thinking about it and experiencing it, of what God is like. Is it conflict and anger and anxiety that lie at the heart of our relationship with God, or is it love? And so, while some people have this tendency, right, to see only one kind of story in the Old Testament, the Deuteronomy type story, the people who experience pain because God is disappointed or angry with them. What happens then is if we see the story only in those terms, we tend to read that into the story of Jesus as well. Jesus' life, in particular, his death, is like further evidence that God is angry and disappointed with us. But also, God loves us, and so God sort of has to deal with all of that anger and injustice by taking it onto the cross with Jesus. And as long as we pray the right things and say the right things and follow the right things, then we'll sort of manage to get away with, if you like, not experiencing the wrath and punishment of God that we so deserve. And I don't know, I suppose at times that does sound meaningful and liberating and beautiful to people, but I have noticed that, when we experience wrong, pain, and suffering, that framework doesn't always help us navigate that. We start asking that question, what have we done wrong? Or what do we need to change? And so there's kind of this acceptance to it, but there's also this question of, what kind of God sits behind all of this, and what does God really think of us? And so in that sense, I think of Jesus' story as its own kind of what Brueggemann calls a counter-testimony, right? Because surely, of all things, Jesus stands as like the example of the person who is most faithful to God, but for whom things do not go well in the end. He's the most faithful one who still experiences loss and pain and suffering. Now, in one sense, maybe that's not encouraging, because like, if even Jesus experiences this, then who are we to get out of the hardness and difficulty of life? But I think what the Jesus story does is it demonstrates to us that the hard things we bump into in life are not because we've disappointed God or that God is judging us more harshly than the person next to us. No, Jesus enters into the story to tell us that's not, in fact, what's going on here. It's not a matter of God being convinced into forgiving us or causing us to suffer so that we will come to our senses, but that actually God's heart toward us is one of belovedness. The story of Jesus is one of this demonstration of a God of love who freely forgives, and he resists power and violence and prejudice and marginalization, but he doesn't resist it with violence. He resists it with self-giving and with love and with extending the circles of care and compassion to all of those who previously had been excluded. And so our connection to God is then not one to be filled with anxiety, concern, dread, worry, all those journal entries I wrote when I was a younger man that always started with a spate of apologies to God for not living up to what I thought God wanted of me. And yet Jesus comes to open our eyes to this reality of the nature and character of God and to our belovedness. Actually, Paul, in one of his letters, when he writes to the church in Rome, and he talks about this idea that it is the kindness of God that leads us to change, right? Kindness, that's what does it. And that's what changes things. So yeah, we're invited, challenged even, to change. But not because God is going to curse us if we don't, but when our eyes are opened to the heart of things, and when our eyes are open to what God is really like, and when our eyes are opened to what it means to be alive in this world with that kind of God, then maybe we want to live differently. We want to relate to people differently. We want to learn how to live and experience and live in peace, not just with God and with others, but in ourselves. And so here's the practice I want to invite you to do. I want you to, the invitation to take a few minutes. As always, if you follow the reflective practices that we do here, I always encourage people to start with at least 2 minutes of just slowing down, paying attention to your breath, rising and falling in your chest, maybe to the sounds in the room or the space that you're in, the feeling of your feet on the floor. Just let yourself settle for a moment, and if your thoughts race in, then just let them race out again and bring your attention back to presence and to breath and maybe to God, or whatever you find most helpful in that space. And so once you bring yourself to that place just of settledness and let the agitation go for a moment, I've just got a couple of, really one simple question for you to reflect on, and then a couple of questions to reflect on the answer to that question, right? So the question I just want you to sit with as you think about this story of Jesus, and as you think about what Jesus tells us about what God is like, just ask yourself this question in that place of stillness. What does God think of me? What does God think of me? Let yourself sit with that question for a bit. And then ask yourself this: what comes to mind? And then what does this tell me about the way I see God? What comes to the surface when I ask that question? What does God think of me? What is it that comes to mind? And then what does that tell me about the way I see God? And when I ask the question, what does God think of me? If it comes layered with pressure and disappointment and expectation and anxiety, then maybe there's some of the Jesus story we just still need to continue to sit into. Or maybe it's going to tell you something else. That's up to you. So what does this tell you about the way you see God? And then also, what does this tell you about the way you see yourself? And in that place, sitting with those questions, invite a sense of peace from God to come. So that's my invitation to you today.